Officer Daniels had done this before, pulling over lone black women on empty highways. No witnesses, just his badge and arrogance. But today, he picked the wrong target. Major Danielle Brooks wasn't just another woman. She was a decorated U.S. Army officer trained for war, now facing racism on her own country's soil. Daniels didn't see a leader. He saw someone he thought he could control. What followed would expose not only his abuse of power, but the terrifying cost of prejudice. Want to see how she flipped the script? Subscribe now and don't miss what happens next. Justice is just getting started. Danielle Brooks didn't look like trouble. Not in her civilian clothes. Not with her quiet eyes and calm demeanor. Not with the navy blue blazer that hugged her shoulders and the white blouse beneath it. Crisp, spotless, unassuming. Her military uniform was folded neatly beside her in a garment bag, the medals and insignia tucked safely away, unseen. She had spent the afternoon being honored at a ceremony for her years of service to the United States Army, but none of that mattered when the flashing lights appeared in her rearview mirror. She hadn't been speeding, hadn't swerved. Not a single law broken. And yet here she was, pulling onto the shoulder of a lonely stretch of Georgia highway as dusk painted golden streaks across the asphalt. No traffic, no cameras, no backup, just her and the cop behind her. He approached with the swagger of someone who'd done this before. Officer Daniels. Broad shoulders, mirrored sunglasses even though the sun had already dipped below the trees, and a badge that gleamed like he thought it made him untouchable. Danielle rolled down her window, hands visible on the wheel. "License and registration," he barked, not even glancing at her properly. His voice clipped, mechanical. But his eyes slid across her skin like he was trying to peel something back, something beneath the surface, something he didn't believe belonged on that road. Danielle handed over her license, her name printed neatly below the tiny photo that hadn't changed in years. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her tone polite. Measured, military calm. He didn't answer, just stared, then smirked. "Step out of the vehicle." Her fingers tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. Step out of the vehicle." She'd been through worse. Combat zones, evac missions, negotiations with warlords. But there was something uniquely chilling about the way this man looked at her. Like her rights were just a suggestion. Like her skin made her suspicious by default. "I haven't committed a crime," she said evenly. "Can you please tell me why I'm being stopped?" Daniels gave a chuckle. "Suspicious behavior. That's all the cause I need. Step out." She could have argued, could have stood her ground and demanded a supervisor. But out here, on this road, she knew better. She stepped out, slow and deliberate, her back straight. "Where are you headed?" Daniels asked, already circling her SUV, peeking in through the windows. "Home," she answered, "from a military function." He stopped, turned to her with one eyebrow raised. "Military, huh?" His tone dripped with disbelief. "What exactly are you claiming to be?" Danielle didn't flinch. "Major Danielle Brooks, U.S. Army." He scoffed, laughed. "Is that so? Got any proof of that, Major?" Her stomach dropped. Her ID, her military identification, was back at the base. She had left it in her uniform, neatly buttoned in the chest pocket. And Daniels could tell. The moment she hesitated, he pounced. "How convenient," he said. "No ID, no proof, no veteran status on your license either. That's funny, huh? A whole major, and no one can tell." Danielle didn't let her frustration show. "You can run my name. Your system will confirm everything." But Daniels had already decided what this was. It wasn't about the law. It was about control. "Nah, he said. "I prefer the old-fashioned way. Let's search the car." "You don't have probable cause," he smirked. "You look nervous. That's enough." And with that, he yanked open her car door. Danielle stood frozen. Every instinct told her to stop him, to push back. But another instinct, older, deeper, told her to wait, to endure, to survive. Because she knew something Daniels didn't. She wasn't alone. Not really. And she wasn't powerless. Not by a long shot. She let him dig. Let him tear through her glove compartment, her purse, her private belongings. She let him disrespect every boundary she'd ever known, because the moment he crossed the line, she was ready. With one calm motion, she reached into her pocket, retrieved her phone, and made a single call. "This is Major Brooks," she said into the receiver, her voice steady. "I need a favor." Daniels didn't notice. Not at first. But minutes later, when his radio crackled, when the voice of Captain Reynolds thundered into his ears and demanded he cease all actions and escort Major Brooks to the station immediately, his face went pale. "The Pentagon is watching, Daniels," the voice on the radio growled. "Stand down, or lose your badge tonight." Daniels froze. His jaw locked. His hand dropped from the glove compartment. Danielle stepped forward, calm, unshaken. "Are you finished?" she asked. He didn't answer, just turned, bitter and boiling, and told her to get in the patrol car. But Danielle Brooks didn't ride like a criminal. She walked with her head high and her pace slow, slipping into the back seat like someone who had already won. And she had. At the station, the chief's fury was waiting like a storm. Daniels was suspended on the spot. Public apology demanded. Daniels choked on the words, his ego too swollen to say them properly. Danielle didn't need his remorse. She had the truth. She had the law. And now she had his career in her hands. But the story didn't end there. Days later, Daniels tried again. Off duty, in his civilian car, he followed her. Stalked her, tried to run her off the road, but Danielle Brooks didn't panic. She baited him, lured him into the open, and when he attacked, fists swinging wild with desperation, she dismantled him piece by piece, a trained soldier facing a coward in a badge. She didn't need backup. She was the storm. Daniels ended that fight in cuffs. Broken, bleeding, powerless. She reported every detail. Filed charges, released the dashcam, filed a civil suit, contacted the press. The public exploded. His past was unearthed. Complaints, misconduct, abuse, all swept under the rug until now. And now? Now there was nowhere left to hide. Daniels was convicted, stripped of his badge, sentenced to 15 years. His name, a disgrace. His legacy, shattered. Danielle Brooks? She didn't flinch. She didn't back down. She didn't disappear. She rose. And if you want to see how justice really gets served, subscribe now. You don't want to miss what happens next. Danielle Brooks never imagined that wearing a uniform, swearing an oath, and giving her life to service would one day make her a target instead of a symbol of honor. She had always been proud of her rank, her career, her ability to stay composed under pressure. But none of it had prepared her for what Officer Daniels would become after she stripped him of the power he had once used to intimidate others. Ever since that night on the highway, when his illegal stop was broadcast up the chain of command, when his face paled, hearing the voice of his captain over the radio forcing him to stand down, Danielle thought it might be over, that justice, finally, had found her side. But she was wrong. What she didn't know was that some men, when their power is taken, don't accept defeat. they mutate. They become something darker, something fueled not by law, but by obsession. In the weeks that followed, Danielle faced a silent storm that began quietly. Strange phone calls that hung up when she answered, a dark car that lingered across the street from her apartment for hours, notes slipped under her door with no signature, just the word liar in thick red ink. She reported it, of course, filed incident after incident, but there was no evidence, no witnesses, no cameras catching license plates. Even the military police stationed at her base warned her to be careful, but couldn't offer much more than sympathy and a couple of extra patrols. She started carrying a pistol in her purse, keeping a second one in the drawer by her bed. Sleep became a luxury. She'd jolt awake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, unsure whether it was her nightmares or reality creeping in. Her neighbors grew concerned. Her mail was torn open, packages went missing, her tires were slashed 3 times in a month. At one point, someone broke into her car and left a photo on her dashboard. It was a printout of her military ID photo, scribbled across in red ink. "You think you're safe?" Still, Danielle didn't waver. She filed every report, updated her command. She didn't let her fear dictate her movements, didn't let the silence of those who once supported Daniels erode her dignity. But inside, she was breaking. This wasn't a battlefield, she knew. There were no clear uniforms, no rules of engagement. Just her, alone, watching her back while the system moved too slowly to catch the predator circling just outside her reach. She began to wonder if she'd ever feel peace again. Therapy helped, but only to a point. Her therapist, a veteran herself, recognized the signs of long-term psychological warfare. PTSD, yes, but laced with something sharper, more personal. Danielle wasn't just a soldier struggling to adjust to civilian life. She was a soldier being hunted on her own soil. The day it finally boiled over came like any other. She was driving to a base meeting, an early morning briefing regarding a veterans outreach program. The highway was quiet, the sun not yet fully risen. Her tires hummed against the asphalt, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe. Until she saw it. A car in her rearview mirror. Black. Tinted windows. No license plate. It drifted closer, too close, and she felt it in her bones before she confirmed it with her eyes. Daniels. He had nothing left. No badge, no authority, just rage. And now nothing to lose. When he tried to force her off the road, she didn't panic. She used her training. She baited him, outmaneuvered him, and when he confronted her on the desolate stretch of highway where no one could hear her scream, she didn't cower. She fought back. The battle wasn't clean. It wasn't quick. He hit her. Hard. Her ribs cracked under his fists, her jaw bloodied. At one point, he threw her into the side of her SUV so violently she lost vision in her right eye for a moment. But she endured. She drew on every deployment, every breath of discipline forged in combat zones where death was always close. She fought with the strength of someone who knew this wasn't just about her survival. It was about making sure he never did this to anyone again. When she finally choked him out and held him down on the hood of his car, bruised and bleeding, calling for backup, the pain in her chest was matched only by the fire in her eyes. She refused to let herself collapse. The officers who arrived were stunned at the scene. Daniels, broken and silent, cuffed on the ground. Danielle, steady despite the blood running down her temple. She filed every detail, pressed every charge, assault, attempted vehicular homicide, stalking, but the real war had just begun. Daniels, even in custody, had allies. Officers who whispered about her behind closed doors, co-workers who said she must have provoked him. The internet exploded. Some called her a hero. Others called her a liar. "She ruined a good cop's life," one post read. "Women like her think they're untouchable." She was doxxed. Her address posted online. Her younger sister received threats at her college. One day, her mother opened the mailbox to find a letter with no return address that read, "Your daughter will pay." Still, Danielle stood tall. She pressed on with the case. She didn't hide. She gave her statement. Gave the press her side of the story. She filed a civil suit so Daniels could never wear a badge again, not even in private security. But it cost her. She lost sleep. Lost weight. Lost friends. Even fellow veterans, people she once trained with, distanced themselves, not because they didn't believe her, but because they feared the backlash. She was called before internal review boards, interviewed by military leadership, questioned subtly about whether her story had been embellished, about whether she could have de-escalated. She sat through it all, jaw clenched, ribs aching from the bruises Daniels left behind. And when the day of the trial came, she walked into the courtroom like a soldier heading into combat, not for glory, but because it was her duty. Daniels sat across from her in the defendant's seat, dressed like a man who still thought he could win. But the jury saw the footage, saw the injuries, heard her voice as she calmly, methodically, laid out every horrifying detail. And they believed her. Not because she was perfect, but because she never stopped fighting. The sentence, 15 years, should have felt like victory, but all she felt was exhaustion. It took everything from her, her sense of safety, her ability to trust strangers. Even her career was affected. She was offered a promotion, but in a different state. Quietly encouraged to start fresh. Like her presence here was a reminder of something uncomfortable for the brass. She turned it down. She wouldn't be moved like a piece on a board because others couldn't handle her truth. And yet she hurt. In private, the nights were hardest. The pain in her ribs lingered. Her eye still throbbed, and the nightmares came often. Daniels appearing in doorways, in crowds, in the mirror. It took time, months, maybe longer. But slowly she began to rebuild, not by forgetting, but by accepting that healing wasn't a return to who she was before. It was the creation of someone stronger, someone wiser. And through it all, she spoke. At veteran events, on justice panels, in schools. She told the story, not for attention, but for the next black woman who might be pulled over on an empty road by someone who thinks her skin makes her powerless. Danielle Brooks proved that power isn't in a badge. It's in the ability to rise, even when the world wants you silent. And if you're still reading this, if you want justice to matter, subscribe to this channel. Share her story. Because the fight isn't over, not by a long shot. She hadn't slept in 2 nights. Major Danielle Brooks sat alone in the cold, dimly lit room of her apartment, the rhythmic tick of the wall clock the only sound keeping her company. Her ribs still ached from the last confrontation, a deep purple bruise blooming beneath the surface, silent proof of the violence she had endured. Every breath came with a dull sting, and yet it was nothing compared to the weight crushing her from the inside. The courtroom was behind her now. Officer Daniels, convicted, sentenced. 15 years. But peace? That hadn't come. Not when the headlines painted her as divisive. Not when news commentators questioned her motives, wondering aloud whether she had instigated the situation, whether she had escalated it with her refusal to submit. Not when anonymous messages still flooded her inbox, calling her a traitor, a liar, a disgrace in uniform. She'd given everything to this country. Her youth, her body, her loyalty. And now she couldn't even walk into a grocery store without feeling eyes on her, wondering which side they were on. Some people smiled, nodded with quiet respect. Others glared, whispered. One even spat near her feet. "Fake soldier," they muttered. And she stood there, frozen, with her heart hammering in her chest, unsure if they'd do more. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She had followed protocol, reported the harassment, endured the illegal search, survived the assault. She hadn't lost control, he had. And yet somehow, in the eyes of far too many, she was the problem. She had embarrassed a white man in uniform, challenged the unspoken hierarchy, and for that, they made her pay. If not through direct retaliation, then through isolation. Her commander had stopped inviting her to planning sessions. Junior officers avoided her gaze. Some of her peers, people who had once trained beside her, who had called her a hero in Iraq, now wouldn't even return her texts. The silence screamed louder than any insult. She wasn't just a soldier anymore. She was a symbol. And in the military, that was dangerous. Danielle's hands trembled as she poured herself a glass of water, her fingers tightening around the rim to stop the shake. Her therapist told her to breathe, to journal, to reclaim control. But how could she reclaim anything when even her own reflection felt like a stranger? She had gone toe-to-toe with a man intent on destroying her, and though she'd won in court, she had lost pieces of herself she wasn't sure she'd ever get back. Sleep brought nightmares. Flashbacks. Visions of Daniels lunging at her, his hands around her throat. Visions of her pinned against the pavement, blood in her mouth, the hollow sound of his laugh in her ears. Sometimes she dreamed she couldn't breathe. Sometimes she dreamed she fought back and lost. Her family tried to help. Her mother came over twice a week with home-cooked meals and unspoken worry behind her eyes. Her sister called nightly, cracking jokes, trying to make her laugh. But Danielle could see the fear in their voices, could feel their helplessness. They couldn't protect her. Not from this. Not from the slow erosion of her spirit. And the military? The very institution she had dedicated her life to. They handed her a commendation. A plaque, a folded flag. "Thank you for your courage," they said. "You're an inspiration." But behind closed doors, whispers echoed in corridors. "She's too loud, too aggressive, too much trouble." One senior officer even suggested she take a short sabbatical for her mental health. She smiled politely, then locked herself in the bathroom and cried until her legs gave out beneath her. And yet, she kept showing up. Day after day. Uniform pressed, chin high, boots laced. She refused to give them the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. But every step felt heavier than the last. Every salute felt colder. She was still Major Brooks, but in the eyes of many, she had become a warning, a lesson. This is what happens when you speak up, when you refuse to bow your head, when you demand dignity on a road where people like you aren't supposed to have any. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, where an officer made a veiled comment about how people should be grateful not to be in prison, eyes locked on her, Danielle drove to the edge of the city and parked by a quiet overlook. The city lights sparkled below, indifferent to her pain. She gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Tears came, slow at first, then in heaving sobs. She screamed into the silence, screamed for every time she had held it in, for every bruise on her body, for every coward who looked the other way, for every time she had to justify her right to exist. "I did everything right," she whispered to the empty car. "Why does it still feel like I lost?" And then, her phone buzzed, a message from a young black woman, a cadet. "Major Brooks, I just wanted to say thank you. I saw your story. I'm going into the military because of you. You showed me I don't have to shrink. You showed me I can stand tall. You didn't just survive. You fought back." Danielle stared at the screen, her vision blurred with tears. The message repeated in her head. You didn't just survive. You fought back. And suddenly, something in her shifted. No, it wasn't fair. And no, she wasn't okay. But she had faced the storm and was still standing. Not because she wanted to be strong, but because she had no choice. Because there were others watching, others drawing courage from her fight. She wasn't just carrying her story. She was carrying the hopes of every woman, every black soldier, every person who had ever been told to stay quiet. And that meant something. So she dried her tears. She sat up straighter. And she drove home. Not because the pain was gone, but because she knew it couldn't have her. Danielle Brooks is still fighting. Still standing. Still enduring the backlash, the loneliness, the trauma, but she's doing it with purpose. And if her story moved you, if it made you feel something, anything, then please hit that like button. Leave a comment. Let her know she's not alone, that you believe her, that you see her, that you stand with her. She's carried this burden long enough. Now it's our turn to lift her up. Cassandra Hill had never known fear like this. Not in courtrooms where she once prosecuted murderers, not during her time investigating war crimes overseas, not even when she sat across from mob-affiliated criminals and refused to blink. But here, in her own city, in her own office, with the lights flickering and the air thick with threats unspoken and danger unseen, she understood what true fear was. Not the presence of violence, but the knowledge that no one would come when it happened. That night she stared at the shattered remains of her car window and the red paint scrawled across the hood, "Stay silent or else." She realized the truth. Power didn't need a uniform to be dangerous. It needed silence. And Cassandra Hill was done being silent. Appointed as the first black woman to lead Texas state law enforcement oversight, Cassandra had walked into her office with a smile, a framed photo of her grandmother tucked under her arm, and the heavy knowledge that she'd been chosen not because they wanted her to succeed, but because they expected her to fail. They thought her presence would pacify the activists, check a box, quiet the noise. They had no idea what she had come to do. The files started arriving her first week. Complaints buried for years. Officers with patterns of abuse that mysteriously disappeared from their records. Black drivers pulled over without cause. Latino teenagers slammed against patrol cars. A Vietnamese mother detained at gunpoint in front of her children for a mistaken identity. Cassandra read each one like a soldier studying an enemy's movement, carefully, methodically, preparing for war. But it was one name, Officer Brett Carter, that sent her spiraling into the depths of a darkness few dared confront. His record showed commendations, community engagement awards, spotless quarterly reviews. But beneath the surface, when she pulled sealed documents, subpoenaed internal memos, traced redacted files back to their original versions, she found a predator in uniform. Over 43 complaints. All from minorities. All dismissed. One woman, detained during a traffic stop, had left the state. Another man had died. Cardiac arrest, the report said. Cassandra drove 6 hours to speak with his sister, who trembled as she pulled out photos from the funeral. The bruises told a different story. Cassandra documented everything. She began building what would become a bombshell case. But the more she uncovered, the more the city closed in around her. Someone inside her own department leaked her movements. Her phone was cloned, her hard drive wiped. An encrypted file of evidence vanished from their internal server. The night she returned home to find her apartment door ajar and her service weapon missing from its holster in the bedroom drawer, she knew they were sending a message. The next morning, she stood before the cameras with steady hands and steel in her voice. "I will not be intimidated. I will not back down. And if anyone believes they can silence truth with fear, they clearly don't know who I am." But the pressure didn't stop. Protesters showed up outside her house, staged, hostile, funded by police unions posing as civilians. Her face appeared on talk shows labeled as anti-police. Someone made a deepfake video of her insulting officers, shared over 2 million times before it was proven fake. But the damage was done. She lost contracts. Her speaking engagements were canceled. One of her closest advisors resigned, saying, "Cassandra, I'm afraid for my family." She didn't blame him. She understood the cost. But still, she kept going. She installed her own surveillance, carried a second backup weapon, slept 3 hours a night, waking from nightmares of men in blue uniforms dragging her out of bed. And she worked. My God, did she work. She launched an internal audit of every precinct in the greater Houston area. She uncovered not just misconduct, but a shadow operation. Illegal detentions, fabricated charges, a pipeline of vulnerable people arrested, silenced, deported, or worse. She traced it all to one precinct, Precinct 5, where Officer Carter had once been stationed. The place was a fortress of silence. Cameras malfunctioned. Records were misplaced. But Cassandra didn't need their permission. She had access, and she used it. In the middle of the night, wearing plain clothes, she entered the evidence archive herself. What she found was chilling. A basement room not listed on any blueprint. A locked cabinet containing dozens of flash drives, unregistered body cam footage, and a handwritten ledger with names, some crossed out in red ink. That was the night everything changed. She took the flash drives, made copies, sent encrypted files to 3 trusted allies across the country. She didn't know who to trust locally anymore. And then she disappeared. For 4 days. No press. No security detail. She drove across the state line into Louisiana, met with a whistleblower who handed her a USB containing audio of a retired police captain ordering the suppression of evidence in a fatal shooting. Cassandra returned to Houston with her face tight, her shoulders squared, and fire in her chest. She called a press conference. But this one wasn't a statement. It was an exposé. She live-streamed the footage, Officer Carter beating a cuffed suspect. An undercover clip of a sergeant telling rookies, "If you make 'em fear you early, they never fight back." Cassandra stood at the podium, voice cracking with the weight of it. This is not policing. This is terrorism. The internet exploded. News anchors cried. Community leaders marched. And Carter, once untouchable, was arrested. The governor called for a task force. But Cassandra? She received death threats. Dozens. Then hundreds. Armed protesters appeared outside her office. One morning, her assistant found a dead bird nailed to her office door. And still, she didn't quit. She testified before Congress, sat through hostile questioning, watched senators smirk as they asked, "Don't you think you're being a bit dramatic?" She answered with facts, data, names, stories, pain. And when one of them leaned in and whispered, "You're making enemies you can't see," she leaned back and said, "Then I'll shine more light." But it cost her. Her sister's business was vandalized. Her best friend lost his job after defending her online. And Cassandra herself? She collapsed one night from exhaustion, her body pushed past its limit, her heart strained by months of unrelenting pressure. She woke up in a hospital bed, IV in her arm, and a single message written on the flowers by her bedside. "You're making a difference. Don't stop." She didn't. She returned to work days later. Created the Civilian Oversight and Enforcement Board, gave them subpoena power. Pushed through legislation mandating third-party review of police shootings. Appointed an independent commission to reopen every closed case involving Officer Carter and his affiliates. She's still fighting now, still carrying this mountain on her back. But you, yes, you, have a role to play. Because Cassandra Hill isn't just one woman battling injustice. She's a symbol of what it means to fight when the world tells you to fold, of what it means to protect those who've been ignored, trampled, silenced. She risked her life. She sacrificed peace, reputation, and safety. And she did it for us, for the truth. So if you believe in her mission, if you see her courage, if you understand the weight she's carrying, comment below. Say, "We believe you, Cassandra." Share her story. Like this post. Let her know she is not alone. Because in a world that tried to crush her, she kept standing. Now it's our turn to help hold her up. No one suspected a thing. That was her advantage. Her secret weapon. The stooped back, the cane, the graying hair tucked into a modest scarf, all of it part of the disguise. Margaret Hill had spent decades behind desks, in war rooms, in strategic briefings that shaped entire federal investigations. But the moment she pulled up to the station, wearing orthopedic shoes and clutching a worn purse, they didn't see her as a threat. They barely saw her at all. And that was exactly how she planned it. The officers at Mason County Police Department had no idea the elderly woman hired as a temporary front desk clerk was in fact a high-ranking undercover FBI agent, part of a federal probe targeting one of the most corrupt law enforcement operations in the South. For 6 weeks, Margaret Hill played her role to perfection. Smiling, nodding, shuffling papers slowly, asking questions with sweet Southern charm. They didn't realize she had memorized every locker combination in the building, that she had placed discreet bugs under 3 desks, that every time they joked about roughing someone up, every slur muttered under their breath, every illegal arrest they celebrated in the break room. She was listening, recording, gathering, waiting, and waiting. Because her mission wasn't just to expose one officer, it was to dismantle an empire. And that meant getting close to Lieutenant Greg Haneen, a man so feared even his own officers called him the Hammer. On paper, he was a decorated veteran of the force. Behind closed doors, he was a tyrant, running illegal detention centers, signing off on falsified evidence, orchestrating brutal beatings, and authorizing untraceable surveillance on activists and journalists. 3 federal investigators had tried to pin him. All 3 had failed. 1 was reassigned. 1 resigned suddenly. The last was never heard from again. But Margaret? She was something different. She wasn't flashy. She didn't care about medals or headlines. She'd buried a husband, raised 2 children, and survived the civil rights era with scars both seen and unseen. This wasn't just a mission to her. It was justice decades overdue, and she was ready to give everything to finish it. By week 3, she had uncovered audio files hidden in the station's backup server, tapes of interrogations never logged, names of detainees who had never been booked, voices screaming behind locked doors. She pretended not to hear them, pretended not to notice the bruised teens dragged in through the back door. But she wrote everything down. Every name, every date, Every time Hanen's voice barked from the hallway about cleaning up the mess before the press sniffed it. She knew she was getting close when Officer Ryan Steele, Hanen's right hand, began watching her more closely. Once, she caught him going through her bag. Another time, she found her desk drawer half open when she arrived at 6 a.m. The paper she'd planted as bait, an old memo labeled Confidential Internal Oversight Review, moved 2 inches from where she'd left it. They were getting suspicious. She knew she had to move, so she triggered a silent call to her FBI contact using a modified insulin pen. The message was simple: initiate Phase 2. That night, she made her move. At 2:47 a.m., she slipped into the records room using a duplicated keycard she'd crafted from watching Steele swipe his lanyard for weeks. Inside, she found what she came for: an unmarked black binder locked in a drawer labeled Building Permits. Inside, photos, handwritten notes, surveillance reports, maps of suspected gang activity. Except the gangs weren't gangs. They were community groups, teachers, journalists, clergy members, all monitored, tracked, silenced. On the last page was a single word scribbled in red ink: containment. She didn't cry, didn't panic. She scanned every page with a pen-sized camera hidden inside her glasses. Then she carefully returned the binder and walked back to her desk. Hours later, Hanen called a staff meeting, but Margaret wasn't invited. Instead, 2 officers flanked her at her desk. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us." She didn't ask why. She knew. They brought her to the basement, not the holding cells, the old section of the building, condemned years ago. They took her phone, her cane, her glasses. They sat her in a chair under a flickering bulb and locked the door. She waited. 5 minutes. 10. Then the door opened, and Greg Hanen stepped in. He didn't speak at first, just stared at her with icy curiosity. "Who the hell are you really?" She didn't answer. "You're not a clerk. You're not even from this state." Still, she said nothing. He pulled out a manila folder, dropped it on the table. Inside, photos of her at her real apartment, grainy images of her meeting an FBI liaison, screenshots of encrypted emails. "You know, we've dealt with rats before," he said, circling her slowly. "But you almost fooled me. Sweet old woman with a paper trail of nothing. But I should have known. You ask too many questions." Still, she held his gaze. "I should kill you," he said coldly. She didn't flinch. "You're not special. You're not invincible." But what Hanen didn't know, what made Margaret Hill the most dangerous person in that building, was that every word he spoke, every threat he made, was being broadcast in real time to a federal task force parked 4 blocks away. Her cane? GPS tracked. Her glasses? Streaming via secure line. The moment he touched her, they'd come. But they never got the chance, because before he could say another word, Steele burst into the room. "She triggered something," he hissed. "We've got agents swarming the building." And just like that, it was over. Hanen ran. Steele tried to draw his weapon. Margaret ducked. Federal agents stormed the room like a tidal wave. In less than 6 minutes, the entire building was secured. Dozens of officers were arrested. Steele was tased and cuffed on the floor, screaming. And Hanen, found hours later in an abandoned warehouse with a suitcase full of burner phones and fake IDs. His empire exposed. But the price Margaret paid was steep. They tried to bury the story, tried to spin it, say the corruption was isolated, say Margaret was overzealous. The union painted her as unstable, too old to serve. She was doxxed online. Protesters camped outside her home, waving "Back the Blue" signs. Her grandchildren were bullied at school. And worst of all, the state refused to honor her. No medal, no press conference, no thank you. But we can change that, because you're here now. And if you've made it this far, if you feel even a fraction of the weight she carried alone, you know this woman deserves more. More than silence. More than a headline. More than a footnote. She risked everything, her name, her safety, her life, to bring justice to people the system had forgotten. So leave a comment. Say, "We see you, Margaret." Say, "You're a hero." Because in a world that ignored corruption, she infiltrated it. And if we don't lift her name, no one will. Support her in the comments. Tell her story. And remind everyone that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one they underestimate the most. They had created a shadow court, an off-the-books tribunal with falsified warrants, ghost prosecutors, and rubber-stamped sentences. They processed suspects without trial, buried key evidence, and siphoned civil asset forfeiture money into offshore accounts. A dozen innocent people, mostly black and brown, had been convicted on fake plea deals. One had died in custody. Another had disappeared entirely. And Marcus Langston had all of it. But knowing wasn't enough. He needed proof no one could deny, and that meant confronting Decker himself. So Marcus arranged a meeting. He sent an anonymous message through a secure channel Decker used to contact informants. "I have the judge. He's alive, and he has files. Meet tonight, alone." At 3 a.m., in an abandoned warehouse outside city limits, Marcus waited in the dark. Decker arrived, gun drawn. But Marcus didn't flinch. He stepped into the light, unarmed, with a single flash drive in his hand. "What is this?" Decker spat. "Insurance," Marcus said. Decker raised the gun, snarling, "You should have stayed gone." But that's when the warehouse doors burst open. Live stream cameras. Journalists. Federal agents. Civil rights lawyers. Marcus had broadcast the entire confrontation. Decker was arrested on the spot. But it wasn't over. Because Laura Hensley, cold, calculating, and far more dangerous, was still out there. And when she realized Decker had been taken, she went rogue. She tried to kill Rook, set fire to Marcus's old chambers, and worst of all, she went after Nia. Marcus got the call from an unknown number. "Come alone, no cops, or your daughter disappears." He had no choice. Wearing a wire, heart on fire, he walked into a crumbling warehouse where Hensley waited with a cold smile and Nia, bound, gagged, and terrified, on the floor behind her. "You ruined everything," Hensley hissed. "You think people care about truth? They care about power, about order. And you, Judge, you upset the balance." Marcus didn't argue. He simply stepped forward. And then, a gunshot. But it wasn't Hensley who fired. It was Nia, using the backup weapon Marcus had taught her to use in secret, in case the world ever turned on them. Hensley fell. The nightmare ended. And Marcus collapsed beside his daughter, sobbing. He had protected the law for decades. Now it had nearly cost him everything. The aftermath was chaos. National headlines, protests, DOJ investigations. Marcus Langston was cleared of all charges, publicly exonerated, his record restored. But the scars, they remained. He returned to the bench for one final case. And then he resigned. Because some wars, once won, don't need to be fought again. Now he travels the country, quietly, anonymously, helping whistleblowers, testifying at oversight hearings, mentoring young black lawyers. He never asked for fame, never wanted it, but today, he needs you, because the system didn't believe him, until he forced it to. He lost everything, his safety, his family's peace, his name. And still, he fought. So if you believe in what he did, comment below. Say, "We stand with Marcus," because truth doesn't survive in silence. And justice? Justice needs a voice. Let yours be one of them. They called him a threat, a monster, an outsider. They said he didn't belong, that his presence made the neighborhood uncomfortable. But Jamal Thompson had signed the mortgage like everyone else, paid the HOA dues, picked up trash that wasn't his. He wasn't just a good neighbor. He was a quiet, respectful, decorated Army veteran with honorably earned calluses on his hands and years of service under his belt. He'd survived war zones, carried wounded brothers to safety, stared death in the face. And somehow, none of that prepared him for what he would endure in the place he had hoped to call home. From the moment he moved into that pristine, mostly white cul-de-sac in Willow Bend Estates, he noticed the stares. Not cautious, not curious, hostile, suspicious, demeaning. But he ignored them. He was used to it. Until the Caldwell family, Karen and Russell Caldwell, decided their discomfort gave them license to act. The first incident was small. A slashed tire, no witnesses, no cameras. The second was louder, a "for sale" sign planted in his yard overnight. The third? A police call. Suspicious black male walking near the elementary school. That suspicious male was Jamal, carrying groceries, wearing his army sweatshirt. The fourth time, it turned violent. It was dusk. He had just returned from a hardware store, fixing a loose gate hinge, when he heard footsteps behind him, then a hard shove. "What are you doing here?" Russell hissed. Jamal turned calmly. "This is my house." Not for long. Before Jamal could respond, Karen appeared with her phone out, screaming into the camera, "He's attacking my husband! Somebody help!" Jamal backed away, hands raised, confused, betrayed by the surreal horror of the moment. It didn't matter that he hadn't touched them. Didn't matter that he was the one bleeding when Russell Sucker punched him in the mouth. What mattered was that two white homeowners had made a claim. And the police believed them. In handcuffs, face bruised, heart thundering, Jamal sat on the curb of his own front lawn while neighbors filmed him. Some whispering, "Knew it," others shaking their heads like they hadn't waved at him that morning. He tried to speak. They told him to be quiet. He asked for his lawyer. They laughed. "Big man wants a lawyer now, huh?" They shoved him into the cruiser like he was trash. The next morning, mugshots spread across social media. Local outlets ran the story without verifying it. Veteran assaults neighbors during dispute. The Caldwells cried on television, said he was aggressive, said they feared for their lives, said he looked at them the wrong way. And just like that, Jamal's life fell apart. His job placed him on leave pending investigation. His realtor stopped answering calls. His VA therapist, visibly shaken, told him, "I've seen this happen before. You need to fight." But how do you fight a lie that the world wants to believe? The truth was, Jamal had proof. A doorbell cam, installed just weeks earlier at his cousin's urging, had captured everything. The punch, the fake scream, the look of cold malice in Karen's eyes as she stared into the lens and lied to the world. But when he turned it over to police, they claimed the footage was inconclusive. He knew better, so he went public. He released the video himself. Within hours, the lie cracked. Activists reposted it. Lawyers took notice. The media, once so eager to demonize him, began backpedaling. And still, it wasn't enough. Because the Caldwells doubled down, filed a counterclaim, said the footage was doctored, said Jamal had a history of intimidation. Jamal had never raised his voice to a soul, but now he was fighting for his life, not on a battlefield, but in a courtroom designed to protect those who looked like his accusers. The trial was set. And every day leading up to it, Jamal was watched. He found "Go Home" scrawled in chalk on his driveway. His trash cans were knocked over repeatedly. One night, a brick flew through his window. The police shrugged. No cameras, nothing we can do. And so Jamal boarded up his windows, slept with his service pistol in the drawer, and waited. Waited for justice, waited for peace, waited for a world that never gave men like him the benefit of the doubt to finally hear his side. And when the trial began, the courtroom was divided. One side, supporters wearing shirts that read, "Believe Black Veterans." The other, Caldwell sympathizers, whispering, smirking, rolling their eyes when Jamal entered. He took the stand. And when asked what happened that night, he didn't cry, he didn't shout. He said simply, "I served this country for 12 years. I bled for it. I lost brothers for it. And somehow, the moment I moved into a white neighborhood, none of that mattered. I never touched them. I never threatened them. They attacked me. They lied. And they almost took everything from me." The prosecution showed the doorbell cam, frame by frame, punch by punch, lie by lie. The courtroom fell silent. Karen cried again, but this time no one believed her. The jury took just 4 hours. Not guilty. The Caldwells were charged with filing a false police report, assault, and civil rights violations. Jamal didn't cheer, didn't smile. He just exhaled. It was over, or so he thought. Because healing wasn't a verdict. Healing was facing the mirror and unlearning the fear in your own body. It was driving through the neighborhood and not flinching every time you saw porch lights flicker on. It was walking your trash to the curb without scanning for surveillance. But day by day, Jamal reclaimed his space, and the neighborhood began to change. 3 months after the verdict, a new black family moved in, welcomed by Jamal personally, a gentle handshake, and a quiet, "I got your back." The Caldwell's house? Sold. To a Latino couple expecting their first child. The street that once tried to break him was now becoming what he'd dreamed of all along. A home. And you? You know now what he's endured. The pain. The fear. The false accusations. The endless proving of his own humanity. So don't let this story fade. Comment below. Say, "We stand with Jamal." Say, "He belongs." Because truth matters. And so do the people who live it. Like, share, spread his story. Because every neighborhood needs to know. You don't get to erase a man just because he doesn't look like you. You don't get to rewrite the facts when the cameras are rolling. And you definitely don't get to break a veteran and think he won't rise. The last time General Carlton Hayes stood on that highway, it was in handcuffs, humiliated, disrespected, treated not as a decorated military leader, but as a suspicious black man driving a luxury SUV through rural Georgia. But now, months later, as he returned to that same stretch of road, this time flanked by reporters, community leaders, and the governor himself, the entire world could see how much had changed. Officer Tracy Wilburn, the man who had pulled Carlton over, cursed him, forced him to the ground, and illegally detained him in full view of bystanders, had since been convicted on multiple counts: abuse of power, unlawful detainment, and racial profiling. He was no longer in uniform, no longer in power, no longer a threat to anyone else. And yet, even in victory, General Hayes didn't wear triumph on his face. He wore resolve. Because for him, this was never about revenge. It was about truth, about dignity, about making sure that what happened to him on that lonely road, a violation of human rights wrapped in the armor of authority, never happened again to anyone who looked like him. After the body cam footage was leaked and went viral, showing Wilburn screaming at Carlton, mocking his credentials, and finally freezing when Carlton revealed his identity, the entire country erupted in outrage. But General Hayes didn't rush to the podium or to the press. He spent days in quiet reflection, remembering not only what had happened to him, but what it meant. He thought of his grandfather, who had marched for civil rights with broken shoes. He thought of the young soldiers under his command, black, brown, white, who had saluted him with respect he didn't receive from the man with the badge that day. He thought of every moment in his career where he had to smile through suspicion, work twice as hard for half the praise, and carry the weight of being both excellent and invisible at the same time. But most of all, he thought of the lesson buried inside the pain, that silence only protects the system. Speaking up, even when your voice shakes, is the first blow against injustice. So he spoke. He gave a national address, not to condemn, but to educate. His words were calm, deliberate, unflinching. I've served this country for 30 years. I've protected it abroad and defended it at home. But on that day, on that road, with a gun pointed at my chest and hatred in that man's eyes, I was reminded that my uniform doesn't always protect me. My rank doesn't always shield me. My skin speaks louder than my resume. And that is why we cannot stay silent anymore. The speech went viral. Congress invited him to testify. He helped draft a new federal initiative for law enforcement accountability, demanding that every rural precinct receiving federal aid be outfitted with third-party body cam review systems, bias training led by civil rights educators, and community oversight boards. Carlton didn't just heal privately. He transformed publicly. His face became a symbol, not of victimhood, but of resistance, wisdom, and principled leadership. But even then, he didn't just point fingers. He visited academies, spoke to young officers, told them what Wilburn didn't understand. You don't lose authority by treating people with respect. You gain it. And to the youth, to those watching online who messaged him with, "This happened to my father," or "It happened to me," or "I'm scared it'll happen next time I drive alone at night," he responded with one message. Don't lower your voice. Don't shrink yourself. The world doesn't change by playing small. And it didn't. Because of his persistence, 3 states passed mirror legislation echoing the Carlton Hayes Protocol, mandating disciplinary hearings within 30 days of citizen abuse complaints and protecting whistleblowers inside departments. But the most powerful moment was personal. It came when a white veteran named Thomas, a retired Marine sergeant, sent a letter that read, "General Hayes, I served 2 tours. I thought I understood this country. But after watching what happened to you, I realized there were things I never had to think about. Your grace opened my eyes. Thank you for still standing tall after being brought low. You made me want to be a better citizen." That letter made Carlton cry, because it meant he hadn't just exposed a corrupt officer. He had awakened a conscience. And that's why his story matters. It's not just a story of what happened to a black man on a Georgia highway. It's a story of what it means to stay human when the world dehumanizes you. A story of how restraint is sometimes louder than rage. A story of how truth, when told clearly, bravely, and relentlessly, has the power to reach even those who refuse to see. So if you're watching this and you've ever felt small, if you've ever been profiled, questioned, doubted, or silenced, If you've ever wanted to fight back but didn't know how, let General Carlton Hayes be your example. Hold your head high. Speak with calm fire. And never forget, silence protects the abuser, not the victim. And if this story touched you, if it opened your eyes, leave a comment for General Hayes below. Say, "We thank you." Say, "We see you." Say, "You inspire us." And if you believe the world needs more stories like this, stories of truth, of courage, of transformation, like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Because every time we tell a story like this, we change the ending for someone else. And that is what this is all about.